You see Peter in his scripts, and he looks up and he goes, "David, who?" And everybody in the edit room laughs, and of course I think that's the joke, that he has no idea who I am. And then you hear Michelle say, "David Muir," and he looks up and he goes, "Oh yes, the chap on the overnight. He's quite good." My first big break had to have been the afternoon when I walked to the mailbox and saw that in the mailbox was a letter from Ron Curtis, who was at the time the Walter Cronkite of my hometown, which is Syracuse, New York. I was 12 years old when I wrote to the local news guy saying, "I hope to have your job one day, and what do I have to do to get there?" It was a typewritten response on the newsroom typewriters, the giant font, and I'll never forget what he wrote at the end of that letter. He said, "Competition in television news is keen, but that there's always room for the right person. It could be you." A short time after that, I went into the station for a visit, and soon after that began visiting on my summer breaks and on vacations, and became the student intern, and often would carry the tripods, which were giant back then, and rip the scripts before the newscast when they still had the 5-ply paper, and would fetch the Cokes from the vending machine and race them to the studio. And I did that for many years, and in fact, every school break that I would show up in the newsroom, they would march me right over to this one place on the newsroom wall where they would measure how much I had grown. I went to Ithaca College to study journalism. Before I graduated, my second semester, senior year, they hired me, actually, that station where I had spent so much time as that kid intern. I would drive up to Syracuse, New York, and anchor the weekend newscasts. But anchoring the newscasts meant you produced them, you wrote the copy, and then you went out there. And I'll never forget, I had a yellow stopwatch and would time the broadcast from beneath the desk. I worked in my hometown of Syracuse for quite some time, and I'll never forget the sort of next big break that came. It was a phone call from Boston, and the news director there, Candy Altman, who'd been looking through stacks and stacks of tapes. She said she had really finished her search, but she tells me to this day that there was something that told her, just look at the next tape that's sitting there.
The voters will get their chance to weigh in on the negative campaigning and the other.
I worked at Channel 5 for a couple of years, and when all eyes turned back to Iraq in 2003, Channel 5 sent me to Central Command, and I was reporting for them. And it wasn't long after, there were a few phone calls from a couple of different networks. And I remember thinking at the time that ABC always just felt like home to me. I had grown up watching Peter Jennings. I remember trying to guess who the person of the week was. Peter Jennings, at the end of the broadcast, when he would sign off, would tape a protective page, as it's called, saying we have a developing story and let's turn to whoever the person who is on standby. And I'll never forget the first night that I was doing that for him. I got a phone call from the edit rooms, and they said, "Come on downstairs, and it involves Peter." And I thought, what have I done? I came down to the edit room, and they were all sort of gathered around the monitor, and they hit play. And it was Peter at the end of the broadcast. He had just said, have a good evening, good night. And then the tape keeps rolling, and you hear the floor director, Michelle, who is still here to this day, say to Peter, who the standby person was that night. And she said, it's David Muir. And you see Peter in his scripts, and he looks up and he goes, "David, who?" And everybody in the edit room laughs, and of course I think that's the joke, that he has no idea who I am. And then you hear Michelle say, "David Muir," and he looks up and he goes, "Oh yes, the chap on the overnight. He's quite good." The most important piece of advice I give is to go out, intern, and make yourself known for all the right reasons. Because I really remember being that little kid as though it were yesterday. And I talk about fetching those Cokes from the vending machine, or ripping those scripts, or racing them to the studio. But I always had a giant smile on my face. And to this day, when I hear from a young person who wants to be a journalist one day, I always try to call back, or write back, or tweet back, because it makes a difference in their lives, gives them a little inspiration and hopefully a little bit of guidance. But I always add, now go out and make yourself known.